Okay, we'll go ahead and start. Good evening and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. And we have a very informative program for you this evening, featuring two Washington Post journalists, Yasmeen Abutaleb and Damian Paletta, here to talk about their new book, Nightmare Scenario, about how the Trump administration so poorly and tragically mismanaged the coronavirus pandemic. Now, a couple of brief housekeeping notes first. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Nightmare Scenario. Yasmeen joined the Washington Post 2 years ago as a national reporter. Previously, she'd been with Reuters, where she wrote about healthcare, and after moving to the Post, she continued covering health policy. So when the pandemic started last year, she was well positioned to report on the administration's response from early on. Damian established a great reputation in the 2010s covering economic and financial issues in Washington for the Wall Street Journal. Then he joined the Post 4 years ago to focus on White House economic policy. 2 years ago, he was named economics editor, so he also had the background and sources to pursue the administration's bungling of the pandemic. In Nightmare Scenario, Yasmeen and Damian say their intention was to provide the first complete narrative about what really happened inside the Trump administration in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. They interviewed a lot of insiders, including members of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. No one they talked to on the task force defended their collective response, the authors say, and no one certainly held up their work as a model for the future. In general, as Yasmeen and Damian note, a number of systemic problems can be blamed, at least in part, for what went wrong. Chronic problems such as underinvestment in public health resources in this country, a decentralized healthcare system, and dysfunctional agencies. But the administration itself made the response so much more ineffectual, often appearing rudderless, conflicted, chaotic, and at war with science. And Trump himself was more preoccupied with messaging and his own political health than with the health of the nation. The evidence of incompetence, insensitivity, and politicization that Yasmeen and Damian have amassed is truly damning, infuriating, and, well, nightmarish. In conversation with Yasmeen and Damian will be a Post colleague of theirs, Ashley Parker, who covers the White House. Ashley joined the Post 4 years ago after 11 years at the New York Times, and her reporting on Russian interference in the 2016 election was part of the package of Post stories that won the Pulitzer for national reporting in 2018. Ashley also frequently appears on NBC News and MSNBC as a contributor. So Yasmeen, Damian, and Ashley, take it away.
Hi, thank you guys for doing this, Damian and Yasmeen, and everyone for tuning in. I assume you have all pre-ordered the book from Politics and Prose, but here it is. It's fantastic. They gave it to me, and I sped read it. And so your book is so great. And I'll just ask my questions, and you guys can fight it out for who answers. But your book is so great that part of me just wants to use this hour to have you recount all the amazing anecdotes in your book. And I'm not going to do that. But there is one I wanted to ask you about that has gotten a lot of attention already. And basically, you report that President Trump at one point suggested sending infected cruise ship passengers to Guantanamo Bay. Tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah. So this was something that really jumped out at us, and for a couple reasons. One, back in February of 2020, there was a lot of focus first on that Diamond Princess cruise ship that was off the coast of Japan. And I think that, there were 500 or 600 passengers on the ship, a lot of Americans on the ship, elderly Americans. And so there was this big fight over what to do and how to get them home. And, there was at the time 360,000 people on cruise ships around the world, right? So there's a lot of people on cruise ships. The virus moves very quickly. And it was constantly in the headlines, the White House Situation Room, they were constantly talking about this, and the president was getting really nervous about the idea of sending these people back to the United States if they were infected. And so at one point he was in a meeting in the Situation Room and said, we're not bringing them back. I don't want them back, because he was, really focused on the number at the bottom of a television screen that said, there's like the stock market is this, and then the number of people who are sick is 14 or 20 or something. He did not want that number going up because he thought that's what people were looking at every day. So he wanted to put them somewhere. And, he always thinks outside the box, obviously. And so he came up with this idea of sending them to Guantanamo Bay. And at first, aides couldn't believe he said it, but he wasn't kidding. And so they did what they often did, Ashley, this, like over the years, they would say, okay, sir, we'll look into that and get back to you, kind of hoping that he would forget about it and that he would never bring it up again. And then sure enough, a few days later in the Oval Office, he asked, what's the status of the Gitmo move? And that's when the aides kind of got together and said, listen, we cannot let this happen. We cannot, this will be a public relations nightmare. We can't send 80-year-olds who are sick to, this island where they can't get the best medical care. And, obviously it was a crazy anecdote and a crazy story, but for Yasmeen and I think it was a wake-up call that, anything that we hear, we should run down. Anything, no matter how unbelievable it seemed, could have been under consideration and could be something that they might have done. And so I think that it was that anecdote that helped propel a lot of the reporting in this book. We need to look into everything. We need to believe anything's possible with this group, because the president comes up with all kinds of things, whether he heard it on Fox News or, from a friend in New York, like he was having all kinds of ideas whispered in his ear, and a lot of them kind of made it pretty far down the track.
And then stepping back a little bit, I mean, I know when reporters write books in general, it often comes out of your beat or an article you've written. And there's nothing new about sort of parachuting in to an environment and immersing yourself in that. But I guess I'm kind of curious what it was like covering a deadly pandemic while you two were living it, not just as reporters, but as citizens and human beings, right? I know, Damian, you have 2 kids who I have to imagine had some sort of nightmarish remote school situation. Yasmeen, you have family in the area. For those of you Washingtonians, Yasmeen and I are both Walt Women graduates, right? But you have family close. I'm sure you were trying to manage that and make sure everyone was safe. So what was it like to write a book about something that you yourself were reporting on, but also living?
That's a great question. I think it took a big emotional toll because it was so much a part of our day to day. We couldn't get together a lot of the time just to sort of brainstorm and work on things in person. We had to do a lot of our interviews over the phone or on Zoom. You can always build that relationship with sources a little bit easier if you're meeting in person, and you can kind of build trust that way. We were cold calling a lot of people and not really able to meet them, a lot of times not able to see their faces. And then, of course, we're all stuck at home and scared. For so much of last year, we were really, really scared for our families, for our parents, for our friends, living in parts of the country that were getting hit really hard. So we were covering this, and we're hearing these stories of how, and I wrote a bunch of them with you about how no one knows who's in charge and the number of task forces and just how off the rails things are so much of the time. And it's stressful. I think it's much more stressful than maybe when we were covering other aspects that were chaotic but didn't affect us so directly, because you're watching the response, you're seeing things clearly aren't going well, the case count's going up. I think the winter was really hard because at that point you have 3,000-4,000 people a day dying. They're really not even focused on the pandemic at that point. And I think it hit home for us how important it was to document what happened and why it happened, because I think we were lucky in that Damian lost his great aunt to coronavirus in the middle of all this. So it was directly impacting us in that way too. But obviously there were a lot of people who suffered a lot more than we did. And I think and it was hard for us. So I think that just kind of hit home how important it was to find the unvarnished truth, to get people to talk who maybe weren't willing to in real time, especially after the election, so that we could better understand what happened.
That makes sense. Sorry, go on.
I would just add to that. I mean, do you remember the first time you walked into a grocery store and everyone was wearing a mask, or like the run on toilet paper There was a moment, in the middle, I guess it was in the spring, when my daughter was at the dentist, and then we got a call the next day from the dentist saying that her hygienist had coronavirus, and like the sheer panic of waiting for the test results. I think we were living this. And I think that made us, this wasn't an abstract thing, that made us, I think, even more invested in getting to the bottom of what was happening. I mean, this affected everyone in the country, and it's just changed everything. There's so many people lost their jobs, so many businesses shut down. And I think that it just made this feel so real. And the fact that we felt like we had something to contribute and to get to investigate and try to unearth, I think that made it like more personal for us.
And before I ask my next question, someone put in the chat that my sound was garbled. I took out my headphones, so hopefully that helps. But if not, let me know again and I'll try to rejigger again. But assuming you can hear me, oh, good, it looks like it worked. So you guys write that you spoke with more than 180 people for this book. And I'm curious how their stories changed over the course of your reporting, right? Were they more forthcoming after the election, after the inauguration, or as often is the case in journalism, after they realized that their colleagues were talking to you?
Do you want to start, Damian?
Yeah, sure. It was interesting. I mean, it was kind of a moving target. I think there were times during the year when they tried to defend their actions more than after the election. There was a fog of war element to a lot of their decisions, which, at times was understandable. None of us knew what we were dealing with at first. And so I think there were times when they felt like they were doing the best they could. Obviously, especially the scientists, they were learning as they went, on masks and stuff. They really had no idea initially if they worked. So I think the stories changed in some ways. That was understandable, but there was definitely a point after the election, and especially after the inauguration, when for some of them, the spin really began, the revisionist history. Yasmeen and I were meticulous in our fact checking because so many of the stories contradicted. And we wanted to make sure we really gave readers an accurate presentation of these events, because these are events that I think need to be remembered, for decades to come. And so, there was a lot of finger pointing at the end. There was a lot of, I did the best I could, but that person was a monster kind of stuff. And so I think the knives really came out, especially after January 6th, when people felt like the administration was kind of burning to the ground. And it made it harder for us to keep going back and reconciling our notes, but we felt like we ended up in a really good place.
That makes sense. And then you guys, when I was reading your book, you made at least one very deliberate choice, it seems to me, which was to begin each chapter with the number of confirmed COVID cases and the number of confirmed COVID deaths. And I have to say, just as a reader, it was incredibly powerful because it sort of reminded me of what you were about to lay out in the next chapter. It wasn't just unbelievable stories, but had pretty real world devastating consequences. And to give you guys a sense, the prologue opened with 5.8 million cases and 180,000 deaths. And by the time I got to the final chapter, we were at 9 million cases and almost 230,000 deaths. So tell me about how you guys decided to make it's a seemingly small decision, but again, a quite powerful one.
Well, I think when we started writing the book, we still didn't know the course the outbreak was going to take, because we started last spring. And I think we were wondering if things were going to ease up over the summer, if by the time our book came out, this was going to be a distant memory that people didn't really want to relive anymore, which of course is not what happened. But, it was actually, Damian deserves credit for that. He was looking at it both from the case count and the economic perspective, watching the case count go up and the Dow Jones kind of go up and then crash down, because the meetings and anecdotes that we document can seem kind of abstract, or you don't really understand their importance. And I think it's much more powerful if you're seeing some petty fight or petty rivalry play out, and you see the count that we're at several million cases and more than 100,000 deaths, and people are still at each other's throats because of some rivalry they have. And I think that just maybe drives home the point a bit more, that lives were on the line, and the indecision a lot of the time, or the delay in getting things done because people couldn't agree or get on the same page, had real consequences. And like you said, I think we found it really alarming when we looked over the course of the book, and we we were covering it in real time. So we were also kind of watching with horror the case count tick up and the death count go up. And then of course it accelerated in the winter. I think it just drives home how important what is and isn't happening is at that point in time.
I mean, I remember writing some of these COVID stories, especially with you, Yasmeen. And one thing we talked about at the time was, we'd write a weekend story, right? But we maybe file the draft Friday, but it's not going to run until Sunday. And we would leave like a blank space for how many Americans were dead, because we knew from when we filed the story on Friday to when it posted online on Sunday, it could tick up by a couple thousand. It was just sort of, I almost couldn't make sense of it, that I was leaving a space. We were leaving a space in our story for how many people were going to die in 48 hours. But another big takeaway I had from your book was just that there was this cascade of mistakes, right? I mean, as you guys put it, a nightmare scenario on almost every level, where anything that could go wrong did go wrong. And now having we're still in it a bit, but having the benefit of hindsight and of in-depth reporting, I'm curious that if you guys could wave a magic wand and sort of change one thing about the administration's handling of the pandemic, what would it be? What do you think would make the biggest difference?
I think there was a window from mid-March through the end of March when the country did rally together. And, quite frankly, at the end of March, the president's approval rating was, I think, as high as it's ever been. He had announced the Europe travel ban. He was doing the daily briefings. He was kind of doing this Papa Trump thing that I think a lot of people liked. He was talking through stuff. He was in charge. And Birx and Fauci were kind of at the peak of their power at the time. And so in that window, the country kind of rallied together. It was kind of almost a post 9/11 situation where people were all kind of in it as a country. And then the president became obsessed with the idea of reopening. And, I think a lot of his external economic advisors had convinced him that this was going to, crush him in the election. Obviously, the layoffs were devastating, and it was, an economic mess. And so he rushed to reopen, and then it became this kind of every state for itself setup. And then you remember there was a kind of the march on the Michigan Capitol. People started getting angry. There were like weapons in government buildings, and you could feel the country starting to pull apart. And obviously after, George Floyd, the country just exploded. So I think that there was that period when opportunities were lost, to kind of keep the country together. This is hard. This was a crazy virus that has no precedent, and it was spreading from asymptomatic people. I mean, there was no easy way to do this, but I think there was that opportunity was lost in that period. And then, you have the Mike Pence op-ed, there's no second wave, just the denial really set in, I think, at the end of May and June, and things just really unraveled from there.
And kind of following up on that, there were several inflection points during the year, right? When the administration almost made one decision, but then they ended up doing something else. There was the mask debate in March. There was the president getting sick with coronavirus himself. There was this final confrontation. I don't even know I think this is just your original reporting, between Dr. Birx and Vice President Pence, but kind of just walk us through some of those inflection points.
So I think you have the first 2 months, January and February, where they're sort of trying to figure out what they're dealing with. And that was really the best opportunity it was never going to be contained just because of the nature of the virus. The nightmare scenario actually came from Dr. Fauci describing what kind of virus this was. It was a nightmare scenario because it could spread asymptomatically. It was respiratory, and there was such a wide range of infection in people, which made it harder to treat and to know what to do. But like you had said earlier, it was just a nightmare in every way. But January and February were really the best opportunities to, get lots of testing in place, make sure that there's adequate contact tracing. And it was always going to spread. Unfortunately, people were always going to die, no matter who was in charge. But I think there were countries that were models, like South Korea and some other countries that ramped up testing really quickly, where they never had devastating outbreaks in the way that we did. So that was a huge missed opportunity. And then, of course, we look into the whole mess with the CDC test and why they didn't go to other companies. That was a big inflection point. And then, like you said, there was the mask debate in March where there was a proposal, and actually, like, already the companies manufacturing masks to send to every American household, which gets yanked off the task force agenda because people are ridiculing the then health secretary, Alex Azar, who's modeling the masks, saying they look like underwear on your face or a training bra. And then the vice president's chief of staff, Mark Short, just yanks it off the agenda and says, we're not doing this. And then you've got the summer where cases start ticking back up. But that was actually a pretty good opportunity.
Hold on, really briefly. I just want to stop you because there is a question that is related to that from Nancy, who asks, who, in your view, is the primary decision maker to not send the masks to the public?
Damian, tell me if you disagree. I think Mark Short was probably the primary decision maker there because he was the one who went to the vice president and said, this isn't ready, let's take it off the agenda. And they were also angry because they felt like the HHS emergency preparedness chief, who had come up with the idea, was kind of freelancing and hadn't gotten approval from the White House for how much it was going to cost.
That makes sense. Sorry, continue. You were moving on to the summer, I think.
Oh, well, there was a point in August where we were back down to like 20 or 30,000 cases a day. That was another opportunity to try to crush it before it picked back up in the fall. And of course, that was totally wasted because they were starting to focus on the campaign again. And then, of course, you have the president's illness. They think it's going to be a turning point, and it's not. And that final confrontation with Birx, where she begs the vice president to tell people to wear masks. The third devastating wave is pretty ascendant at that point. It's 6 days after the election. When she asks him to do this, she figures there's nothing to lose. And of course, that doesn't happen either. So I think we were pretty stunned by the number of opportunities there were to turn things around.
And then I kind of want to stick with the president's illness, right? Because at that period, there was this brief hope. I mean, I remember reporting it in real time as well, inside the White House and sort of in his orbit, that he might emerge a changed man, right? More empathetic, more serious, somehow better equipped to handle the pandemic. That never happened. But in your reporting, did you find a moment where it could have tipped? Was there someone who almost got through to him? Was there a way he seemed like he could have taken an alternate path? And also, why do you think he kind of emerged the same as he ever was?
That's a great question. So our reporting found that obviously he was very sick at the White House, and he, does that long walk across the South Lawn, which for me is like the moonwalk. I mean, I'll never forget it. It was just an amazing moment. And then in Walter Reed, we had Dan Scavino, Jared Kushner, and Mark Meadows all there with him in that presidential suite, with masks and gloves and everything. And, he was quite sick. They put him back on oxygen there. He was given like a heavy, cocktail of drugs, including steroids that it seems like really kind of jacked him up and made him feel like Superman. And, those steroids saved his life. But at the same time, they made him think that he had whipped it. He almost didn't have a chance to reflect. You remember he did that kind of weird drive around with the Secret Service, yeah. And so he like just couldn't sit still. And so Fauci and Redfield were in close contact with his doctors. They were checking on his condition to make sure he got the care he needed. But by the time, and they didn't know what was going to happen, and Redfield was every step the president took walking back up the South Portico on the Monday he was discharged. Redfield was praying every step that he's going to acknowledge this is real. He's going to acknowledge this is real. We're going to change course. We're going to change course. And as soon as he took off that mask, Redfield knew it was over. I think the president, he was a month from the election. He was obsessed with not losing. And he just said immediately, like, don't be afraid. We can't be afraid. We can beat this. And then that's when everyone knew it was over.
That makes sense. And then you also describe a moment in mid-April when Trump tweets out Liberate, right? And he's referring to Liberate Minnesota, Liberate Michigan, Liberate Virginia. And Dr. Fauci later tells you that it was a quote unquote defining moment for him. And I'm just going to read a little bit of what he said, which was, "It was a smack in the face waking me up." I guess you kind of tell me about that. How did it wake him up? And more than that, how do you think it changed Dr. Fauci's behavior for how he was going to handle kind of everything he was dealing with going forward?
Our understanding was he saw that as kind of the point of no return, that the doctors did have some influence with Trump, actually quite a bit of influence for a few weeks. They convinced him to extend the shutdown for another 30 days. People were rallying and trying to do the right thing. He obviously always had this itch to reopen. Even when he would make the decision, he would kind of undercut it and keep saying, we're going to reopen, this doesn't work anymore. But when he wrote the Liberate tweets, I think Fauci and the other doctors were just stunned because it was the most overt way of dividing the country. And I think they were just like, we cannot come back from that. And then, of course, like Damian was talking about earlier, you see people in Michigan storming the Capitol, and it kind of broke the country in two. And I mean, it was everything. It was whether you wore a mask or not. It was how seriously you took the virus. It was how much you thought things should reopen or not. There was like no middle ground anymore. It was either you were all in, you wore a mask, you socially distanced, you stayed at home, or you were over it and you believed Trump that this was going to end and it was just time to go back to normal. And I think he just thought you can't unite the country after something like that. It's impossible to come back for that one. And what Fauci also said was he didn't fully appreciate how much Trump supporters hung on his every word. I don't think a lot of people appreciated that. And when he said that, he knew a lot of people would take that to heart, and that it just wasn't going to be something you could come back from, and that the president had kind of made up his mind about what direction he was going to move in. And of course, you see in the next few months that Fauci becomes much more outspoken, sort of more blunt and contradicting what Trump and his aides are saying. And I think it's probably because he makes this assessment that he's just going to talk to whoever's going to listen to him.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of Dr. Fauci, he and Dr. Birx kind of came off as two of the most complicated characters in your book. And actually, one thing I loved about your book is it felt like I got kind of mini bios or mini magazine profiles on both of them. And I learned so much actually about Dr. Birx when she was young, when she was competing in science fairs. But I guess I'm kind of curious, do you agree that's an accurate reading, that they were kind of the most complex characters in this whole disaster, and sort of being such complex figures who are grappling with such different inputs? And you guys can talk more about this, but right, like Dr. Birx is a military person, so chain of command is of utmost importance to her. How did that equip them or maybe complicate, again, how they responded to this virus?
We spent so much time talking about Dr. Birx between the two of us. I mean, we really wanted to try to figure her out. And we talked to people that have known her for 40 years. And they still don't completely understand her. I mean, she's an incredibly complicated person. I feel she's a very private person. She doesn't really flinch, when the president said she was sitting beside him when he said we need to reopen by Easter, and she didn't flinch. She was sitting nearby when he said, the whole bleach thing, and she didn't flinch. But we know that she was burning inside with, at times, anger, at times disgust. She could kind of see her reputation dissolving before her eyes. She knew that she could see the mistakes happening real time. She did not challenge the president in public because she believed in the chain of command, and she felt like she had more influence on the inside. She also knew that she could be fired, at any second. So whereas Fauci, was a little more indestructible politically, she could be fired. So she, we felt like she did kind of tactically have a brilliant move in late March when she publicly praised the president. And then, right as that 15-day to slow the spread clock was winding down, she, with Tony Fauci, kind of marched into a meeting on a Saturday night in the Yellow Oval Room, which I've never even heard of before, but it's in the residence of the White House upstairs. And the president was completely on the ropes. One of his best friends was in a coma with coronavirus. The president, of course, watches TV all the time and could see the hospital in Queens, people laying in gurneys in the hallways. I mean, he knew the virus was bad because it was like right all over New York. And she kind of brilliantly said, Mr. President, that's going to be every hospital in the United States if you reopen. I mean, that was a genius thing to say to him. And so he said, okay, we'll extend it for 30 days. In that moment, she kind of played her role perfectly, but that moment only lasted a moment. And then pretty soon, as soon as, the aides got her away from him, he was itching to reopen again. And then we saw the kind of slow, reputational destruction of Dr. Birx, which, ended with Scott Atlas entering the picture in like late July and August. She was treated much differently than Tony Fauci. He was lionized and bobbleheads, and
I mean,
everyone thought it was
mixed drinks on 14th Street, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
There's signs in people's yards, and Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, really went after Deborah Birx for, it was just incredible the way she was treated differently. So we tried to portray her as a, three-dimensional person who was very complicated and who needs to be understood better, her role in this, because it is, we thought, something that was quite historic.
And just sticking with the doctors for one more minute, you described this very vivid moment where Dr. Fauci sits down with his wife, I believe at their kitchen table, but correct me if I'm wrong, and he basically debates with her whether or not he should resign. And if you, like I have, covered Trump long enough, you realize that just about everyone in his orbit at some point or another has that conversation with a partner or with a friend or with themselves. And Fauci, like just about 90% of people in Trump world, makes the decision to stay. And people do that for all sorts of different reasons. Dr. Birx also kind of has that internal question, makes the decision to stay as well. I mean, again, what do you think or what do you understand their reasons to be for staying? And also, how does this track with, again, the choice that almost everyone in Trump world, again, for better or worse, can kind of justify to themselves why they believe they need to remain in that orbit?
Well, actually, I think you know better than any of us that most of the time people justify to themselves that they're protecting the worst from happening. And when you're watching from the outside, you're like, what do you mean they're protecting the worst from happening? All this awful stuff is still happening. But then I think when you learn about an incident like him proposing people go to Guantanamo Bay, and they're like, well, I kept that from happening. And I think one of the things that Damian and I were so struck by when we tried to piece together how things got to the point they did at the end of the year, it was that people would say, they asked for something so crazy, and I didn't give them the craziest thing they wanted, but I did have to give an inch to get them off my back. And then, of course, that just gets worse and worse and worse as soon as you kind of open that door. And that moment with Dr. Fauci, I think one of the things that's important to sort of explain is, one thing that Damian and I were pretty excited about in reporting this book was that we also looked at their relationships, both Birx and Fauci, because they really made their careers in HIV/AIDS with HIV/AIDS activists who really held them to account in the 80s and 90s when AIDS was a pandemic and they felt like the government didn't care and wasn't doing enough. And they maintained those relationships for 30 and 40 years. So when COVID came around, a lot of the AIDS activists turned their attention to COVID activism, and they figure, we've got an open line. They had an open line to Fauci, not so much to Birx anymore once she went to the White House. But what happens is one of the activists who's very close with Fauci, Peter Staley, if you remember, we were covering it at the time, the White House put out that Oppo list on Fauci where they said, we're concerned about the number of times he's been wrong. And it came from the official White House communications office. It wasn't like...
That was going to be one of my questions, but I'll just ask you now. I mean, just talk for a minute about, so people understand just how unusual is it for an administration to do an on the record named Oppo dump on one of their top public health officials?
I mean, I think you're probably better positioned to answer that. But it was crazy because, usually when you do these palace intrigue stories about a relationship between the president and one of his aides deteriorating, they put out some generic statement like this person's a trusted partner, and while they might have disagreements, they're here to protect America at the end of the day. And instead, they sent this list that was like, we're concerned about the number of times he's been wrong. And they tick off a dozen instances, of course, missing lots of context and sort of selectively picking quotes. And Peter Staley, the activist, calls Fauci, and he's kind of talking to him on a pretty regular basis, a couple times a week. And he says, what are you doing? Why are you still there? What difference are you even making anymore? And he asks him, like, where do you have influence? Where are you making a difference? Don't you think it's time to think about leaving? This is so insane. And it resonates enough with Fauci that he wants to take it to his wife, who's like his most trusted advisor, and see what she thinks. He doesn't really want to leave. I think he still feels like he can make a difference through his media appearances. People kind of hang on his every word at this point. And he talks with his wife about it, and they ultimately, she says the White House has become kind of toxic. Do you still really want to be there? But they ultimately decide he should stay because otherwise there's not going to be that sort of strong voice pushing back against a lot of the misstatements out of the White House. While there might have been people who thought they were doing what they could behind the scenes. No one was doing what he was doing publicly. And they feel like he's going to maybe lose that megaphone if he doesn't stay as part of the task force.
Um,
Can I just add one thing? I mean, it was clear in retrospect, it's crystal clear, but Trump was obsessed with Fauci. Okay. I mean, he was obsessed with him, and they were kind of polar opposites. One guy's big, one's little, one's kind of has a history as an anti-vaxxer. One like spends his whole career making vaccines. They're both from New York. And, you know, remember when Fauci was going to throw out the opening day pitch at Nationals Park, and then an hour before, Trump's like, I'm throwing it out at Yankee Stadium, you know, like he was just obsessed with him. And there's a scene in the book, I think it's in early August, when Trump hauls Birx and Fauci and some others into the Oval Office, and he says to Birx, like, every time you open your mouth, I get depressed. And then he goes to Fauci, I spend half my day answering questions about Tony Fauci. I'm the president of the United States. And Fauci's like, here we go. You know, he was obsessed with this guy who just wouldn't go away, and he couldn't fire him. So I think that their kind of like weird dance, you know, that they continued throughout the year was something that really drove the president crazy, to the point where right before the election, the president said, kind of promised to fire him. And then he ended up becoming so obsessed with trying to overturn the results that he never got around to it.
That is a silver lining indeed. So then I guess one question is, you guys in your book recount this pretty epic fight between the CDC and the Office of Management and Budget, where the Office of Management and Budget is trying to weigh in on the CDC's guidelines. And you give the specific instance, right, where they're trying to define what quote unquote social distancing means for restaurants. And at least in this example, the CDC ends up kind of caving to this political pressure that the OMB is exerting. And growing up in the area, and I assume most people actually, like, I sort of always understood the CDC to be an apolitical agency, and that really its superpower came from being an apolitical agency. So I guess I'm curious, how does the CDC come back from something like this, both institutionally with our relationship with the White House and with the public, who now can very rightly potentially views them in a very different way?
That's such an important point, and I think it's something we're continuing to cover, how the CDC rebuilds itself and how they regain the country's trust. And they're still not there. I mean, that's going to really be an ongoing process. It was so battered last year and just kind of came to its knees, that in a way that just stunned everyone, especially public health and scientists who rely on the agency. I think one important thing about the CDC that makes its job really hard is it's not a regulatory agency. So it puts out guidance, but it's essentially like advice for the states. They don't have any power to actually enforce their guidelines, but people rely on them because they're supposed to have the most up-to-date science. And, you know, one of the biggest disasters of last year was because the White House got so involved in the agency's guidances, which on its face is not super unusual when you're dealing with something with as big as political implications as, you know, shutting schools, or when to reopen schools, or when to reopen businesses. Of course, the White House is going to weigh in. Because that's just such a multidimensional problem. But the degree to which they weighed in, and like the nitty gritty that they weighed in on, was so unprecedented. I mean, this fight, like you said, about what social distancing meant in restaurants, you know, they didn't want restaurants to have to space their tables 6 feet apart, because then that meant you had lower capacity, and then the economy wouldn't come back as fast. So people saw this, and then what happened was the agency couldn't get its guidance out in time, and states, instead of having something to rely on and then build on for, you know, what made sense for them for their transmission rates, it was like 50 different reopening plans, which was such a disaster. And sometimes you can learn from that, like, oh, it worked well in here, maybe it didn't work so well here. But the way it happened was so scattershot and so disorganized that there was no way to even look at what was working and what wasn't. It was such a disaster. And I think it's going to take a really long time for the agency to rebuild trust. It is an apolitical agency. The only political appointee there is the director. Everyone else is pretty much a career scientist or a career official. But even with that, I mean, you saw the agency get totally battered. And I think it probably drives home the importance of its leadership. Obviously, it's not all on the director. There's a number of other people there. But I think you've seen the Biden White House sometimes overcorrect for what happened. So you can see it's a really difficult problem to solve. You can say you're going to follow the science, but that doesn't always work, because with something like this, it's not just the science that you have to take into account.
I have a bunch more questions, but I see questions piling up in the queue as well. So I'm just going to ask 2 more and then I'll turn to audience questions. And again, if you have an audience question, just put it in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen and I'll try to look for them. But both of these questions, I'd love for each of you to kind of take a crack at them. One is, without coronavirus, do you think Trump would have won re-election?
I think he would have, yes.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how the rest of the year would have played out, but when in January and February, when he had survived impeachment and the economy was doing really well, the Democrats were kind of in disarray in their primary. If you remember, it's hard to remember now, the Iowa primary just was such a disaster. He was looking pretty unstoppable, I think. And I mean, even with coronavirus, it still wasn't as big a margin as you might think.
And then last question before I go to questions. What lessons did you learn writing this book that you would impart to a future administration grappling with a deadly pandemic?
Well, I think, Yasmeen and I talked a lot about lessons learned, toward the end of writing the book. And obviously there's a lot of things that needed to be done in terms of like updating the stockpile and, research and development. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is honesty. If the public trusts you, then they'll give you the benefit of the doubt, and they'll let you, they'll kind of let you lead if the public believes what you're saying. And there was just so much conflicting information coming out of the government that people decided they had to believe one side or the other. And eventually that just, doesn't work when half the country believes one person, half the country believes the other, and there's a deadly virus that doesn't have a political party. I think that was kind of the most dangerous thing. So I think the lesson learned is just to be honest. I know it's hard and it's not always popular, but honesty I think really would have helped a lot at the beginning, especially.
Yeah, I completely agree with Damian. I think there's more systemic issues that are maybe for policy experts and epidemiologists to debate and talk about what the country needs at that level. But at the political level, I think so much could have been prevented if, like Damian said, they had just leveled with the public and been honest and sent consistent messages on things like masks and how to protect yourself and how to protect your family. It was all over the place that you had to decide who you believed or take matters into your own hands. And I also think, even independent of Trump, the other big lesson is that you have to be willing to move fast and do things differently. Outside of just the White House, there were some decisions by the health agencies that were just way too slow because they're used to being able to have academic science and the perfect clinical trials and the perfect data. And I think they learned the hard way that's just impossible in a situation like this. You're always going to be outmatched by the virus.
All right, so there are so far 11 questions and about 17 minutes left. So we'll see how many we can get through. The first one from RJ. How much of the coronavirus response was driven by the ideology of political appointees in the Trump administration, given that especially given that many conservatives preach a small federal government?
Mm-hmm. There was a huge issue initially. One of the first scenes in the book is the big debate in the Situation Room about shutting down flights from China. And there was a real reticence, especially from people like Mick Mulvaney and others, to have the government kind of interfere with trade and commerce. And they thought people like Matt Pottinger were, kind of scaredy cats and that they shouldn't be listened to. So there was definitely a reticence initially. And also there was a whole kind of libertarian argument about mask wearing and, a constitutional right to not have the government dictate, that sort of thing. So I think that did play a big role. The president wanted to downplay this because he was afraid of the political repercussions of it really happening, and then there was these times when he would kind of overcorrect and say, I can tell the states what to do, I'm in charge, this like super federalism idea that a lot of Republicans weren't comfortable with. So I think politics, drove a lot of the decisions.
And this question is from Nancy. Did your reporting indicate that Trump had any concern for the health of the American people, or was it all a political calculation?
We obviously don't presume like we know everything he was thinking, but from what we could gather in our reporting and the anecdotes we heard, it was very much politically focused and public relations focused. I think that outburst with the doctors that Damian mentioned earlier is a pretty good example of that, where he sort of thinks it's the way they're talking about it that's the problem, not the fact that the virus is on the move. And even when he gets sick, he gets upset because he had this event with Gold Star families the day after the big White House event they had for Amy Coney Barrett, which ended up being a super spreader event. And he tells his staff, "You're letting people get too close to me. You know, if one of these people was sick, then I'm going to get sick." Of course, disregarding that he had been in a number of instances where he could have gotten sick in the days before that. But he's not so concerned about other people's safety in that. He's concerned about his own vulnerability. So I think that's I think a lot of what we understand about his presidency in general too.
And this is from Fletcher. What was the role of the political side of the White House? It appears that every decision was gauged by how the base would react.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one incident in particular where there was a meeting in the Oval in July. It was with his campaign staff, actually. And they were talking about masks, and Jason Miller and another campaign advisor were saying, listen, the polling on masks with Republicans is not bad. If you have a mask mandate, like 80% of Republicans are fine with it because they think it'll help the economy reopen. And they were trying to sort of lead him to water, essentially, like, this might work, this will help you. And Kushner was in favor, he thought it was a no-brainer. But Mark Meadows was like, absolutely not, the base will go bananas, we cannot do this. And the president agreed with Meadows. And so I think the president thought Meadows had a good sense of what the base would go for. At the beginning of the book, one of the reasons Alex Azar is kind of out of favor is because he tried to almost lure Trump into banning e-cigarettes and flavored, vaping, and the base went bananas over that. So Trump was like very attuned to policy changes and how they would affect the base. And I think a lot of times he ended up kind of bending in whatever direction they wanted.
And this question is from Krista. How optimistic are you about our ability to combat the coronavirus over the long term with the dangerous variants that keep on emerging and the stalling in US vaccination rates? What factors might enhance our success and what barriers stand in our way?
That's a really great question. I think obviously the country's in a much better place with the vaccines, and fortunately the vaccines have shown to be highly effective against all the variants so far. But I think with the Delta variant, especially in pockets of the country where they have, less than 30 or 40% of the region vaccinated, that's going to be a big problem. And health officials are anticipating outbreaks in the fall. And the tricky thing is the coronavirus is a highly efficient virus. So the more it can spread, even if if vaccinated people are highly protected, it's going to keep mutating among unvaccinated people, because as we've seen over the last year and a half, these new variants keep coming about, and they're always not necessarily more deadly, but more transmissible than the one that was circulating before it. So as long as that happens, I think no one can really relax and put their guard down. And they're already talking about re-implementing mask mandates in the next couple of months as the variant spreads. So there is reason to be hopeful, but I think the low pace of vaccinations in lots of parts of the country is cause for concern, and does mean that, more transmissible forms of the virus can sort of keep popping up.
This question is from George. I'm going to guess you guys don't necessarily have an answer, but I'm going to ask it anyhow, and you can take a crack at it if you want. During late spring of 2020, what was President Trump doing to ensure he could maintain his relationship with Vladimir Putin as the pandemic began to spread?
Pass.
Yes, outside of my wheelhouse.
I'm sorry, George. This next one is from Jerry. In your reporting, did you research what the Obama administration had for their pandemic plan that the Trump administration either ignored or recommended? And the shorter version is, how much time might have been lost because they didn't act on an existing plan in the previous administration?
That's a great question. Great question. So a few days before Trump was inaugurated, there was a meeting in the Eisenhower Executive Office building with essentially all of Obama's cabinet and all of Trump's incoming cabinet. And it's a tradition that had started, I think, a couple administrations before, and they walked through various, kind of catastrophic events to try to prepare the new cabinet for how to respond. So one, I think, was a active shooter in a college campus. One was like a tornado or a hurricane or something, and how to respond to that. And the third was a pandemic, a respiratory, like a flu. And someone shared with me a photograph of everyone in the room, like sitting around the table. It was amazing. It was like Mike Flynn, Mattis, all these people, Mick Mulvaney. And what was striking about it was almost all those people were gone when the pandemic came. So many of the, Tom Price, the first health secretary, lasted like a year. Like so many of the people, I don't even know if they were paying attention during that briefing, but so many of the people who the Obama administration had tried to help and bring up to speed were gone by the beginning of year 4 when this pandemic happened. So they never really even had the playbook, even though the Trump folks threw out the playbook, but they never even had the background conversation to know the questions to ask and who to call if such a thing were to happen.
I mean, that turnover, just briefly, that reminds me of Kellyanne in her office had this amazing photo of everyone getting sworn in, taking the pledge, like right on inauguration day. And literally, as you would go in her office and you would see each person was just like whited out. I mean, she didn't literally white it out, but you could look and you're like, oh, Reince, no longer in the White House. Bannon, no longer in the White House, right? And it was just like these last men standing. It was kind of Jared and Kellyanne. So that is a really smart point I hadn't thought of how that would affect a pandemic. So this is from RJ again. The Republican Party has tried to use Dr. Fauci now as a boogeyman to motivate its voters. How much damage do you think this does to the current coronavirus response?
I think it does a lot of damage. He's the president's chief medical advisor. I mean, he's still out on TV all the time trying to tell the country what to do, but I think you can see the damage. His approval ratings were really high last year, and you can see that they've taken quite a dip because the conspiracy theories about him and, the sort of hate towards him was kind of confined last year to a specific part of the Republican Party, and it's become way more widespread. I mean, like Tucker Carlson on his show was calling for him to be criminally investigated over what, I'm not sure, but, and then at the rally over the weekend, Marjorie Taylor Greene, they were chanting, lock him up. I mean, it's gotten really bad. And I mean, it's almost, it's kind of unbelievable how much they fixated on him, all because he, was inconsistent on masks like more than a year ago now. And I think it does a lot of damage because he's kind of one of the most prominent scientists in the country. He's obviously not the only one. There's lots of great scientists out there, but because he is so visible and people associate him so much with both governments' responses, if you're villainizing him like that, then I think that just overall brings down a lot of trust in science and scientists generally. And you can see it. I mean, you can see these scientists on Twitter all the time getting harassed if they talk about, anything that's slightly controversial.
This question is from Jerry. Do you guys think that anyone from the administration will be held accountable for the 400,000 plus avoidable coronavirus deaths?
That's a tough question. One of the things that compelled us to do the book was we knew that there had to be some journalistic accountability for what happened last year. After 9/11, there was a 9/11 commission where they went through everything and studied everything to write a big report about what happened. And it appears like there will be nothing like that after this, one of the biggest catastrophes in American history. So, we felt it was really important to hold people accountable. There were this many deaths. There were a lot of victims, innocent victims who never even got to say goodbye to their families, who died alone in a bed, with a nurse squeezing their hand. And so we felt like we really owed it to people to get to the bottom of this and I guess let history kind of sort out the rest. But I think that was one of the things that really kept us going.
And there are 3 more questions in the chat, and I think we can get through them. So from Carolyn, she's saying she thinks that Trump received Regeneron while he was hospitalized, correct? And her question is, did your reporting from his doctors and hospital staff seem to suggest that it was the steroids that helped him rather than the Regeneron, or which sort of, and I know I will also add, and this was a question I was going to ask but didn't, but now kind of will, there was this kind of amazing scene where the FDA commissioner gets this frantic phone call from the White House asking if his agency can sign off on a compassionate use authorization for a monoclonal antibody treatment as soon as humanly possible. And it turns out he's calling on behalf of President Trump. So sort of her question about Regeneron versus steroids. And I'm also kind of curious just about that backstory to get him the antibody.
Sure. So he did get Regeneron. That's right. And at the time it was an experimental drug. It hadn't been authorized for use yet. So that's why they called the FDA commissioner and asked for this authorization. And the FDA has to provide it within 24 hours for any patient. And they don't need the patient's name. It can be anonymized, but they do need, all of their medical history, all of the drugs they're on, so that they can make sure whatever drug they sign off on isn't going to react adversely with something they're already on or exacerbate some underlying condition that they might have. And so the White House is calling Steve Hahn, the FDA commissioner, and saying, can you do this in a few hours? And Steve Hahn goes to the career officials and they're like, they don't know it's Trump yet, but they say, no, we really need to go by the book on this. And, the White House basically wants him to cut corners and speed it up. And then when he realizes it's for Trump, he's like, you wanted us to cut corners for the president? I mean, that's insane. But yeah, I think one of the people we talked to who was familiar with Trump's condition that weekend said that they were almost positive it was the monoclonal antibody that was responsible for his quick turnaround, because it's one of these drugs where if you give it early in the course of the infection, it can be highly effective. We don't know for sure, but it did seem like the steroids kind of jacked him up for that return to the White House and the walk up the steps and his moment of ripping off the mask. Like, it definitely gave him a burst of energy. But the people we talked to who knew about his medical condition and his information said that they thought it was the Regeneron drug that really turned him around.
And this question is from Kavita. And the question is, clearly some checks and balances need to be implemented. Whose role is that? Is that congressional oversight? What sort of restructuring should occur? Should the CDC be pulled out of HHS? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that, that it probably all needs to be modernized. I mean, that's one of the benefits of doing a review, is to see like what worked and what didn't, especially structurally. So, when you had these agencies, when you had a health secretary like Azar, who didn't really have the respect of the, agencies like the leaders at FDA and CDC and elsewhere, that just is a bad setup for something like this. And whether that means you need to, organize the agencies differently or make sure these people have like a good working relationship, I'm not sure, but there needs to be some kind of bureaucratic soul searching, before the next time this happens, because it'll happen again. And I think the sooner they have that conversation, probably the better.
I will say, I think a lot of people would love a congressional oversight report because they can get access to all sorts of information, but it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen right now.
Mm-hmm.
And why won't that happen?
I think it's such a dark spot for the Republican Party. It was obviously not handled well, and it was a huge reason why the president lost the election. And I think it would probably reflect poorly on a lot of them that more of them didn't speak up on masks or against some of the president's statements that were misleading or not true. I think there are just a lot of people who would come off pretty poorly in a review like that. And it was obviously a huge disaster. And I think that just inherently makes it very political.
Sorry, that's just an emergency flood alert. We're going to take a final question from Nancy, then I have one last question for Damian, and then we'll be done. So from Nancy, did your reporting indicate that Mark Short, Meadows, Mulvaney, et cetera, kind of the whole crew, did they have any regrets about their role during this crisis? If Yasmeen, you want to take me, because I have a final question for Damian.
Oh, sure. That's a great question. I think we found some instances where Mulvaney, for the short period of time he was chief of staff at the beginning of the year, he obviously said some things publicly that were weird, and not in line with what they were feeling privately, where he said that the Democrats were using coronavirus against Trump in late February, which our reporting found at the same time they were already starting to debate a Europe travel ban, and they wanted to get Trump to take it more seriously. And he did tell the president at one instance, you think you're running on the economy and you're not. And that was in February or early March. It's hard to say for people like Mark Short and Mark Meadows. I think their approach to this was very much in line with their kind of general belief and approach to government, that the government shouldn't have a heavy hand in these types of things, and it should be up to people to decide. And I think they would probably not change their minds on how they felt about masks or mask mandates, because they feel like that's an individual choice and not something that should be imposed by the government. And, we know from our reporting that throughout the year, they thought a lot of this was being overblown and that the doctors were just advising things that were too draconian.
And I have been told that Damian has a cheesy story about how he always wanted to write a book since he was a little kid. And now that your dream has been realized, I'm just curious if you could share with us.
Sure. Thank you. So when I was like 12 or 13, I was on an airplane and I was, for some reason, not sitting with my parents, but there was like a stranger sitting next to me, and I was reading a book, and he said, it was talking to me like, what's your favorite book? And I told him at the time, my favorite book was this book called There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom by Louis Satcher, you know, who wrote Holes. And so we're walking off the plane, and the guy's like, I'm Louis Satcher. Like, I wrote that book. And so for, you know, as a kid without access to like the internet,
Was that
or
actually
even
true, or was he?
Yes,
Okay.
it's true. And because I wrote him a letter like 5 years ago, because my son was reading Louis Satcher, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's come full circle. And so just meeting an author as a kid, you know, and we're seeing they're like normal people with like scuffed jeans and just like us writing back in Coach, I think always made me want to think that it was possible to write a book too. And so, you know, then you kind of forget, and you're kind of midway through your journalism career. And then this opportunity came for Yasmeen and I, and it was, I think what was so fun about this, even though it was a terribly dark, you know, experience writing about it, was that we let the book kind of come to us. You know, I have an economics background, she has a health policy background. It was kind of, I think, a great pairing for the crisis that we faced. And so, you know, even though I had that experience all those years ago as a kid, meeting a famous author, like we were able to let the book, you know, to do the book on our own terms. And so I think that's what made it almost such a, you know, better experience for us at this point.
Well, I will just say, I loved the book. I am so glad you guys did it, but I'm also so glad to have you both back at the Post as colleagues and editors.
That's not
We're
at
glad
all,
to have you.
that's not at all a cheesy story, Damian. That's wonderfully inspiring. Sorry,
Thank you.
great moderating, Ashley, as always. And Yasmeen and Damian, there's so much detail about what went wrong and why in your book. You really have laid a rich factual foundation to help us all determine ultimate accountability. And, you know, as your story shows, once again, leadership really counts in a crisis. And in this pandemic, it was clearly lacking at the national level. So let's all hope that the right lessons get learned, and that next time, you know, many more lives are saved. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Nightmare Scenario. Signed editions are available at the store, courtesy of Yasmeen and Damian, who stopped by today. And now we're all going to, I guess, run into our basements before the floods arrive. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.